Hey, I'd like to go ahead and get this kicked off. We were slated to go at 6 o'clock, and it's about 6:05, so I want to respect everyone's time. So first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Dan Brennan. I am your police chief, and our police department is trying something new, and we're calling these citizen forums. And the purpose of the Citizens Forum is to talk about policing issues, law enforcement issues in your communities. So as a police chief, oftentimes I get contacted by citizens. It used to be by phone or email. Now lots of times it's by social media. So Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, asking questions about crime in Wheat Ridge, staffing in Wheat Ridge, and asking about specific kinds of issues that are of importance to a group of people. So human trafficking, prostitution, traffic in Wheat Ridge, quality of life issues, and nuisance code issues have all been things that citizens have brought to my attention, and we try to respond to that. So in a course of discussions last year with my leadership team, we talked about how we could do a better job in outreaching to the community, and we came up with the idea of these citizen forums, these opportunities for citizens to engage us about specific issues that are going on in the community. So I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things for your police department. If you haven't picked up a survey, we have a citizen survey in the back on the chair or the table by the cookies. They would ask you to fill out. We use these citizen surveys. We send these out routinely every month to about 50 victims of crime in the city to try to get an assessment of how people perceive crime, actual crime and their perception of crime and their fear of crime, and also as a way to determine what the level of customer service was that they received from the time that they called our 911 center to our response and follow up on that particular call. It's really important to me and my leadership team that that we meet our vision and mission statement. And our vision statement is exceptional people providing exceptional service. That's what we strive to do day in and day out. We don't always achieve that. We're an organization of human people, and sometimes we don't meet the mark. Doesn't mean that we're failing as an organization. We've set a pretty high and lofty goal there that we'd like to meet. So over the course of the last 2 years, I've heard a number of comments and concerns that have been expressed about crime. So to help me in this presentation, I've asked my community service officers, Phil Schroeder and Tori Burton and Kayla Holliday, to talk about quality of life issues. If after this presentation, if you've got concerns about animal control or code issues, quality of life issues, please talk to those folks. I've got our crime prevention team here to share information on programs that we offer as an organization. I've also got a member of our traffic team that are here to talk about, can talk to you about traffic concerns. There are generally three kinds of concerns that get expressed on a day-to-day basis to the police department, and they essentially go in this order. Quality of life issues, code enforcement issues, my neighbor doesn't mow their lawn, they've got trash and debris, they've got a couch on the porch, that kind of stuff. Followed by, animal control calls for service, right? And then we get the traffic calls for service. There are too many cars speeding in my neighborhood. That's generally a pretty common one for our community. Concerns around school zones, speeding cars in there, parked cars, parents parking their cars, dropping kids off, tends to be a real hot button issue in this community. And then crime. This perception of crime, and lately this perception that crime is higher in the city. So I'm going to present a PowerPoint presentation to you to sort of go over crime, what it looks like, what it's about, how we measure crime. I'm going to do a little comparison of crime in our community and compare it to crime in other communities to sort of give you a sense of where we're at in terms of that. So the first slide I'm going to talk to you about is how we present crime statistics and crime data. So there are really three ways that crime is measured. The FBI is sort of the central repository for crime statistics, right? So every crime report that we take is turned in to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. We send them a monthly report on crime that's been reported to us. It's a very defined way of reporting crime. The Uniform Crime Reporting, or UCR data, is the most commonly referred to kind of crime data that's out there. It's very old. It was developed in the 1930s. The definitions are a little archaic. They're very old. They haven't changed a lot. And when it takes a snapshot of crime, it really doesn't look at all of the crime that was committed. It looks at the most serious offense. So let me give you an example. Your house gets burglarized, your car gets stolen, they take your checkbook, and on the way out, they assault somebody, right? In that particular category of crimes that have been committed, a burglary, a theft, probably a fraud at some point because they'll use your ID to cash checks, right? And then an assault. The most serious crime that was committed there was the burglary. So when you look at UCR statistics, it reports the burglary, and go back to the other slides here. It reports the burglary. It doesn't report anything else. So what the FBI has been working on since the 1990s is what is called NIBRS. And NIBRS is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And what NIBRS is attempting to do is capture a real reflection of crime, right? So NIBRS would capture all of those crimes, the burglary, the assault, the theft, the fraud and forgery, and the assault. It would capture all of those. But the fear by a lot of police chiefs like me and others is if we change suddenly from the UCR model of reporting to the NIBRS model, citizens are really going to be shocked at how much crime is in their community. So the way that I look at crime in Wheat Ridge is by incident. I want to see all the crime to get a true reflection of what is occurring. So you could have one incident of a crime being committed, but 5 or more incidents of actual crimes that occurred in that one incident. So I'm going to try to walk you through what that looks like to give you a picture. So I'm going to refer to UCR data, the Uniform Crime Reporting data, because that's the most common way of reporting crime today. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what our statistics are showing. And you'll see some analogies there, some common themes in that. So we're going to walk through that. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and ask them as I'm going through the presentation. And we'll have time at the end for a little Q&A. So there are two types of UCR crime. There's type 1 crimes. So those are your most serious felonies, and I'll show you what those are in a minute. But those tend to be homicides, sex assaults, and burglaries, thefts, larcenies of a felony value, and serious assaults tend to fall in the type 1. The type 2 crimes are the other kinds of crimes that might occur. Somebody breaks into your car, we call that a first-degree criminal trespass. Somebody steals property from you that is a misdemeanor, so it's got a threshold amount, is different than a felony theft. So the felony thefts would show up in type 1, misdemeanor thefts would show up in type 2. And then there's some status crimes like domestic violence and runaways that show up as type 2 crimes. And being a runaway is not a crime, it's a status offense. And a domestic violence disturbance or a domestic violence charge is really a designation on what the actual crime that was committed. So in a lot of domestic violence cases, you have assaults. So we charge the assault, but we label it domestic violence assault because the district attorney and even the police department, we have to handle those types of calls a little bit differently than we might a typical assault because it's a domestic relationship. So there's protection orders and restraining orders, other safety concerns that are involved in that. And then there are other programs once the court settles the case that might be available to the victim and to the offender, right? So you'll see some of that data there. I want to talk a little bit about the numbers. So what crime looked like in 2016, a little bit about what it looks like in 2017. I will tell you and give you the headline, crime is up. It's up nationally. It's up locally. It's in Wheat Ridge and throughout the metro area and the state. And the crime increases that we see are pretty close in correlation to what other communities our size and larger are seeing. We'll talk about some reduction efforts that we're trying in Wheat Ridge, so you're aware of what we're trying to do. And hopefully at the end of the meeting, you'll promote these forums and some of our prevention programs to your neighbors, so that we can be a stronger community through our prevention efforts. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some critical issues that are going on in our community. So next slide, please, Sarah. So just a little bit of a background on statistics and what you're going to see. You see that bell curve. You're all familiar with the bell curve, right, except for maybe the student in the room, but you'll learn about it in school. So the bell curve is really designed to show us what the standard deviation is in regards to the number of crimes that are reported. So, you have, the normal range where the majority of crimes might be labeled, and then as you start to see either increases or decreases, you'll start to see a standard deviation in there describing it as moderately low, very low, extremely low, and the same on the high end. So when we do our analysis of crime data, that's what we look at when we look at annual averages, and then we look at crime over a 5-year period of time. If you really look at crime beyond 5 years, it's really difficult to make correlations because there are a lot of factors that impact crime that may have changed in a particular community. In a recent article I read, a criminal justice article, there are over 30 factors that might impact crime in a community, right? Where the community is located. So I tell people, if you take Wheat Ridge and you moved Wheat Ridge out to the Eastern Plains or the Western Slope, it'd be a whole different community. You could probably police this community with half of the officers that we have if we were a standalone community like Fort Muller, Oregon, or Delta or Montrose, Colorado. We'd have unique problems based on those areas that we're in. But the fact that we're an inner ring suburb in a large metropolitan area really impacts what our crime looks like, because it's not just Wheat Ridge people committing crime in Wheat Ridge, it's people from throughout the Front Range and sometimes out of state. So all of those have an impact. The age of your community has an impact. Your crime reporting trends have an impact. How much traffic you have going through your community can have an impact. Education can have an impact. There are a variety of factors. And then on the other side of crime, the other thing that we look at is what we call the routine activity theory. And the theory is that you have a correlation of factors that are involved in a crime. You have the offender, who the offender is, and that offender has to overlay with the location that the crime occurs and the absence of what they call a capable guardian. You can also say that's the victim. And so when those circles intersect, that is where you have the opportunity for crime. So I'll give you an example. You have somebody who has a drug habit, and they need to feed that habit. And so they're looking for a quick fix, right? They're looking for some quick cash. So they're walking down a dark street at night, and there are cars parked on the street and in driveways, and some of those cars are unlocked, right? And so they go through that car rifling for purses and wallets and GPSs and anything else that they might be able to sell or use, so they can have that fixed. So you've got a set of factors that occur there, not a lot of guardian kinds of things, because people aren't locking up their cars and not securing the property, so you have this absence of ownership, right? Accountability for that stuff, and you have a crime occur. That's a pretty simple example of where that theory fits into that. Next slide, please. So here are, I covered this earlier, here are the type 1 crimes that we're going to sort of look at. So UCR divides those into what they call violent crimes. So homicide, forcible sex assault on an adult, robbery, aggravated assault, so that's like a felony assault. So you get punched, somebody breaks your jaw. That's an aggravated assault versus a simple assault where I punch you and you get a black eye, right? It's the degree of injury, it's the severity of serious bodily injury that distinguishes that. So you'll see oftentimes in UCR data this comparison to violent crimes versus the property crimes that are included in type 1 crimes. So your serious crimes, burglary, theft, fraud, forgery, motor vehicle theft, and arson. So we're going to take a look at what type 1 crimes look like, give you a little bit of an explanation of what it looks like in Wheat Ridge, and then we'll talk about type 2 crimes. So if you look at type 1 crime statistics, I'm going to show you a 5-year trend going from 2011 to 2016. So 12 years ago when I got here as your chief in 2005, crime was pretty high in the city, and we instituted community policing, problem solving. We've instituted a procedural justice program, all in an attempt to deal with the issues of crime, and we really had a pretty significant impact on crime. Now, there's a number of other factors that have impacted crime. Employment's been good, the economy's been good, and so it's kept crime at pretty low levels. But we started to notice in 2012 an increase in crime. It dipped in 2013. It really dipped in 2014. And then in 2015 and 2016, we started to see some pretty significant increases in overall crime. Now, can anybody give me an explanation to why we might have seen those increases in crime? Drugs have an impact, but I wouldn't say so much that I can tie a direct correlation to marijuana, but I can tie a correlation to heroin and opiates. We've seen a significant increase in the amount of heroin and opiates in this community over the last 2 years. Very similar to the phenomenon that they've been seen over the last 5 years on the East Coast and West Coast. It's kind of moved in. So I can buy an eighth of a gram of heroin, a hit of heroin, for less than I could buy a Percocet for on the street if I was looking for an opiate. And so we've got sort of an epidemic in the Front Range and in Colorado right now around heroin and around meth. So we've seen some pretty significant increases in meth. So people that tend to get hooked on those drugs don't work an 8 to 5 job like you and I might, right? They are looking for opportunities to, get money for their next fix. So they, commit crimes to do that. They're stealing property, shoplifting, stealing stuff out of cars, those kinds of things. That's one correlation to this. The other correlation to this anecdotally, we can't point to, specifically to say that is, although the economy's good, we have a lot of people who can't afford to live, the way that we do. There's a lack of affordable housing. People don't have the opportunity to, to buy a home like we did maybe 20 or 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago. So there are a bunch of factors that go into this, that we're trying to track and figure out. But sometimes, it's like putting your arms around smoke and trying to figure out, what specifically is causing this problem. But this trend that you see upwards is not unique to Wheat Ridge. I'm going to show you some stats here in a little bit that are going to show that, Arvada, Lakewood, Golden, Denver, in the state have seen significant increases. Some have seen increases in violent crime. We've not seen significant increases in all of violent crime, but we do in property crimes. So motor vehicle thefts, pretty significant increases in that, and we've seen pretty significant increases in burglaries and trespasses to cars. Thefts are up, those kinds of things. So, it tells me to a certain degree that the people are don't have the means to purchase things, or they're trying to address maybe a particular habit that they have, or address a need that they have, and the only way they can do it is through the commission of crime. Next slide. So this gives you just a little bit better breakdown of what we're talking about here. So let's talk about aggravated assaults. We've seen an increase of about 54% from 2015 in aggravated assaults. Again, these are felony assaults. It fits into the extremely high category when you compare the number of assaults that we had in 2016-91 to the 5-year average of 57. So what are some factors that impacted aggravated assaults? Well, one of the factors that's impacted aggravated assaults is the legislature has changed the definitions of some crimes. So before, strangulation wasn't considered necessarily a serious bodily injury. kind of situation. If there were bruises, it's probably a misdemeanor. Because of research in the area of domestic violence, you know, our legislators recognize that, you know, strangulation can be a pretty serious injury, and so they've upped that to a felony level. Now, that explains part of it. It doesn't explain, you know, all of it. So we've got 1 year of data to go on in terms of an increase, and so we want to see what 2017 shows to see if we can look into that and say, you know, is there a common theme among our victims? Is there a common theme among the location and the suspects involved in that would generate, you know, that kind of crime? Adult sex assaults, although the numbers are small, a 5-year average of 20 to 31, it's a 41% increase in terms of the number of adult sex assaults that have occurred in the community. I'm going to tell you right now that we do not have a sexual predator running around in the community sexually assaulting women or young children. That's not a case. We don't have that kind of perpetrator. In the majority of these cases, the suspect is known to the offender, and the dynamics that are involved in that oftentimes are people who put themselves in situations either through their intake of alcohol or drugs that leads to a non-consensual interaction that gets reported later. That is sort of the methodology of looking at those kinds of cases to say, hey, what's the common theme here? It's concerning. I think one of the things that we're working with the District Attorney's Office on, and from a prevention perspective, is trying to, you know, to educate, you know, our young community members about the dangers of putting themselves in bad situations. You know, situations where they're consuming a lot of alcohol, consuming a lot of drugs, or they're just in the wrong place, right? And even though they might know the person, you know, they're in the wrong place. So we're trying to do education around that. Here, I think, is the biggest driver of crime in Wheat Ridge is motor vehicle thefts. This is a statewide program. The state recognizes motor vehicle thefts are a problem. They've created task forces around this to address these issues both from a deterrence and an education prevention perspective. We participate as an agency in the Metro task force on this, but we've still seen a pretty significant increase, 14% from 2015. So our 5-year average of motor vehicle thefts in this community was about 182. You know, we had 299 last year, and these numbers are still high. We'll show you some 2017 numbers that show that. And then frauds and forgeries have increased. A lot of this increase, I think, is due to our education efforts in advising people of the kinds of scams that they might be vulnerable to, right? A lot of these involve elderly individuals, and we're a community that has a pretty high demographic when it comes to people at age 60 and older, right? And some of it, these reports now are mandatory. We have an elder abuse law that took effect 3 years ago, and so they're much like child abuse, where you have this mandatory reporting system. We have the same reporting system for elder abuse as well. So let's talk just a little bit about, on the next slide, Sarah, a little bit about what does this look like from a mapping perspective. So this map shows you all of the Part 1 crime that we talked about. Remember, there were 299 incidents of motor vehicle thefts that occurred. So you know, there's a lot of those sprinkled in there along with other crime. But when we look at this, we call this a heat map. And so the significance of the yellow and the orange and maybe the red is that there's more crime in that particular area. So when I look at this as a police chief or my staff back here, when we look at this, we're looking for clusters of crime. You know, where are the clusters of crime? And that's a busy map, right? But when I look for the clusters of crime and the heat, I see the I-70 and Kipling corridor as an area of attention, right? It's an area that we recognize, you know, that there's a high incidence of crime in that area. So then we look and say, well, what does that area look like? So we know that we have a lot of hotels and motels in that area, and the majority of those hotels and motels tend to be lower tier hotels and motels. So they capture a certain demographic of the metro community, not our community, but the metro community. People traveling through and people who live in the Denver metro area, but these are the kinds of places that they reside at. We have some areas there that are shopping areas that tend to be a little more quiet, but there's an impact both from the traffic that goes through that particular corridor and the types of individuals that frequent that area. We also, to the north of our city limits, there have a very large retail complex, that is in Arvada, and on the east side of Kipling, we have a business offices, and we also have a retail corridor there. But that's an area that we're trying to pay particular attention to. We have done a couple of programs in there. We've got one now we call the I-70 Crossroads Project, where we're trying to outreach to all of the businesses in that area to try to provide them information on crime prevention, things that they can do to sort of harden their businesses so they're at less risk of crime. And we're reaching out to the homeless people, individuals that we have in that area, trying to provide them resources on where they can get help. Some of you may not be aware of this, but the other question I get asked a lot is, Chief, there's a lot of homeless people in Wheat Ridge, and there didn't used to be that dynamic, right? So you see them at I-70 Kipley panhandling, might see them at the Applewood Center, over at the town center. And so a couple of dynamics have occurred when it comes to homeless individuals and panhandling, and I'm going to simplify it. It's really a complicated topic, right? But the simple answer to a lot of people's concern about the increase in the number of homeless people is attributable to a couple of things. About 5 years ago, Denver started to see a significant increase in the number of homeless people that have moved into the state. Other communities like Grand Junction, in Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, saw similar kinds of experiences. Some of that is attributable anecdotally to the legalization of marijuana. People who tend to be homeless tend to fall in a variety of categories. One is, they've lost a job, maybe they got injured, they had a medical bill they couldn't pay, can't afford to live where they lived before, and so they had to move out, they're living out of the car. Those people we can get resources to and get up on their feet pretty quick, right? But the other group of people that are involved in, that are in this homeless situation tend to be people who have mental health problems, so they're not able to integrate into the mainstream society, or they have alcohol or drug abuse issues, or it's a combination of mental health, alcohol, and drug issues. And so you see these addiction issues, you see these mental health issues with a lot of folks who are homeless. So it's trying to figure out a way that we can reach them and provide resources to them with available programs. I can tell you that Jefferson County's trying to address from a county level the homeless issues. We're trying to from a municipality perspective, and we're working with a lot of nonprofits to say, how can we address this? But what's occurred is you've seen the sudden influx of homeless people into the Denver metro area, and every time Denver squeezes the balloon on homelessness, and so they clean up camps and try to move people along, it drives an element of those people out into the suburbs. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is some people who are homeless are really good people. They're down on their luck, but as one woman recently told us who was homeless, we asked her, well, why'd you come to Wheat Ridge? You're homeless. What's the situation? Why'd you come to Wheat Ridge? She said, it's safer over here. And I think for a lot of homeless people, the suburbs are a safer environment than downtown Denver. So that's one of the dynamics that we've seen with that. The other dynamic is the panhandling ordinance that we have. A lot of communities was ruled unconstitutional. Both the state Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court said, hey, if you want to stand on a corner and hold out a sign and ask for money, you can do that. So we have a really tough time unless there's a violation of a traffic law or some sort of disorderly obstruction kind of situation from having those folks move along. So that's a dynamic that we're facing. So this is over the course of a year. It certainly, to me, what it tells me is, along our major arteries, that's where we see a propensity of crime. Sort of makes sense. You have more people in those areas. And they tend to center around some of our commercial corridors. So when you go to Safeway or you go to Sprouts, to shop, that's what law-abiding people do. There's a group of people that go to the parking lot because people leave their cars unlocked, right? And it's an opportunity to commit crime. So that's why you tend to see that. That's not an unusual kind of cluster. All communities see that. If you were to look at crime in Belmar or the Colorado Mills or Cherry Creek, you'd see a similar kind of cluster of reported crime because there's a lot of people and there's a lot of property there. Next slide, please. So when we look at the 2016 UCR stuff, you'll see a couple of numbers. On the horizontal axis, you'll see the years. Again, a 2011 to 2016 comparison. And you'll also see, on the vertical axis, you'll see numbers. So these are the number of reported incidents per 1,000, all right? So bigger cities will do per 100,000. So we divide it down to per 1,000 to do our comparison. So you'll see, just like on our incidents stat that a slide we showed you a little bit ago, you'll see a similar kind of move. In 2011, crime was high. It dipped for the most part. And then in 15 and 16, we saw crime start to increase. And if we were to look at the bell curve, it falls into that moderately high area. Next slide, please. So they always tell you in law enforcement to never compare your city to another city because the dynamics are always different, right? But it is sort of a tool to use to say, well, how's my community look compared to other communities, and how safe is my community? So you'll see, we've listed 5 cities, including Wheat Ridge, there for comparison purposes. So Lakewood and Arvada are certainly larger than Wheat Ridge is. Golden is smaller. Denver's the big dog in the room, right? They're the big metro community. And so here we list the Part 1 crimes that were reported in the second column as UCR crimes. So the numbers are pretty significant when you look at Wheat Ridge at 1,800 Part 1 crimes committed in 2016. You compare that to Arvada at 3,500, Lakewood at almost 11,000, and then Denver at 36,000, and then Golden at 587. Each of those communities and ours have some unique circumstances and characteristics that reflect the crime that occurs in that community. But if you look at the 5-year average, you'll see all of those communities have seen an increase in crime in 2016 compared to where they were over the last 5 years. And if you were to put that into a bell curve and look at a standard deviation, they're all moderately high. Lakewood, though, has seen the most significant increase in crime. And part of that, from my 40 years of experience in the job, I think, is attributable to the fact that both Lakewood and Wheat Ridge, touch West Denver. We touch the western edge. We're inner ring sort of communities. Arvada touches most of Adams County to the east of their jurisdiction, and Golden is really sort of a second tier kind of community, so it's a little further out. But each of those communities have different characteristics. But the important thing from my perspective to you as citizens is, crime is up. So how do we address that as a community? Next slide. So the type 2 crimes, I touched on that earlier, sort of catch everything else, and that might occur from a crime perspective that a community might want to measure. So some of these are felony crimes, like first-degree criminal trespass. Is essentially, if I break into your car and steal something, that's criminal trespass. If I break into a shed, that's criminal trespass. If I break into your house, that's burglary. So trespass, alcohol-related crimes, criminal mischief could be spray painting. It could be a graffiti issue. It could be damaging somebody's property. Curfew's a status offense that they measure. Defacing property is another way of measuring, graffiti-related kinds of things. Disorderly conduct is a crime. The domestic disturbance is not a crime, but it's a captured category because we like to see how many disturbances that we're going to versus crimes maybe that we're dealing with. DV is a status to an assault or a harassment. Could be a criminal mischief, but it's related to a domestic relationship. Drug-related violations, DUIs, prostitution, runaways, a status offense. This is where they capture sex offenses against a child, theft of motor vehicle parts, and weapons violations. Next slide. So if you look at type 2 statistics, it's down, So I can't give you a reason. If you look at this and remember the previous slide, it sort of tracks in 2011. I think we're about 2,000 offenses, so those are generally more serious offenses on the type 1 side, but it tracked pretty closely, but we've seen this continuing decline of reported crimes in all those categories. But I'm going to show you another stat that's going to say in some of these categories crime is up, but overall in all of those type 2 crime statistics, it's extremely low. So it's trying to, I sort of relay it to looking at a smorgasbord of different kinds of things that might point us in a direction of saying why are we seeing increases or decreases. So here you'll see in this pie chart that domestic disturbances and domestic violence related crimes of all those type 2 crimes account for over 30% of all the crime in that category. That's followed by criminal trespasses, and then vandalism or criminal mischief, and then drug-related violations. The other kinds of things that you might see in the community in terms of type 2 crime statistics are pretty low in terms of total percentages. Runaways at 4%, disorderly conduct at 3%, curfews at less than 1%, alcohol violations at 2%, DUIs at 6%. Next slide. So here's an interesting, I find this in the next slide pretty interesting. So we have averaged over the last 5 years between 33,000 and 35,000 calls for service. All right. In 2016, we were up to 47,000 calls for service. So there are there's one reason for part of that increase in that we changed our definition of how to define a call for service. So there were some things that occurred that were officer-initiated activity that didn't necessarily fall into a captured call for service, so we wanted to capture all of our data. But that doesn't explain the significant increase. And this trend of calls for service has continued to this year. We are busier this year than we were last year in terms of total calls for service at this point. So I'm not sure if that's because citizens are more willing to report crime or we're having more crime or at least more requests for service, because a call for service may not equate to a crime. So the other piece of that 47,167 is out of all those calls for service, about 13,814 resulted in a case report being written. So that gives me an indication that there was a crime that occurred or there was an incident report. So it could have been a civil situation that an officer took a report on, or it was a situation where there was an arrest made in terms of that. So if you look at that, about a third, a little bit less than a third of all the total calls for service result in some official police kind of action in terms of a case report number. We issued close to 5,900 traffic summonses. That was up significantly last year. Our traffic accidents are up in the community, and you only have to drive down Wadsworth or Kipling at rush hour to realize that there's a lot of traffic moving through the community. So, the city's trying to address that, with CDOT. There'll be some major work that'll be done on Wadsworth. We think that'll begin in 2018, 2019. That'll align that to what we see in Arvada and Lakewood with 6 lanes of traffic. That will certainly help, but we also have to address the I-70 and Kipling corridor, because that's a difficult area to get through. Our arrests were up last year compared to the previous years by about 200 or so. So that again is an indicator that there are some dynamics that have changed. Accidents were up. Field interview contacts are up as well, but those are situations so that you understand what those are. An officer might get called to a suspicious person, or might observe a suspicious pedestrian at 2 or 3 in the morning, and they get out and contact them. They fill out a field contact card that just documents that, hey, I contacted Dan Brennan at 2 o'clock in the morning at 38th and Reed, and said he was just out and about taking a morning walk. But if we have a burglary at 38th and Reed, he'd be the first person we'd go talk to, right? So that's why we capture that information. So an overall view of what 2017 looks like. This is January to July. So type 1 crimes are up about 8% from 2016. And they're up 16% from that 5-year average. So that's pretty high compared to where we've been over 5 years. And again, we're seeing aggravated assaults as one category in there that is significantly higher than the other areas. Remember that we talked about type 2 crimes being down overall in 2016 and 2017. They're up 9% from 2016, but they're still down 11% from that 5-year average. Again, the data on the type 1 crimes is still reflecting what we saw in the previous charts, that motor vehicle thefts tend to be a pretty significant challenge in this community and other communities. Aggravated assaults are certainly up. Sex assaults are still up compared to previous years. A couple of other things on sex assaults that I should have mentioned earlier is, the reporting requirements on sex assaults have changed as well. So if you followed, the news over the course of the last 2 years, a person can go to the hospital and have a, they call it a SANE exam or a sex assault nurse exam, and have the forensic evidence collected and an incident report's taken, but they never have to tell us about what occurred, but we have to still capture the fact that that sex assault occurred, and the motivation in terms of doing that is to get the victims of sex assaults to the hospitals so forensic information can be obtained, because what we've learned is, victims report in different ways, and the trauma of a sex assault sometimes can affect a person's willingness, the embarrassment of that, the situation they might have been involved in. So we collect the evidence, and the hope is we give them the resources and the information that they need to have, so eventually they'll make a report and we can follow up on that and make an arrest. We talk a little bit about human trafficking and prostitution. So this was a big concern on a couple of the Wheat Ridge Facebook sites that exists with different residents in Wheat Ridge about a couple of Asian massage therapy centers that exist in the city. So this gives you an overview of prostitution offenses over the last 5 years. The 2017 zero to date is not accurate. We've actually had some activity in that recently. We made one arrest for a prostitution-related incident at one of our Asian massage parlors, and we've also dealt with some violations of state massage licensing laws with a couple of these places. So there are a couple of issues with what human trafficking and prostitution look like, and I've got some experts here if there's some questions that people have afterwards. The human trafficking piece is we recognize in Jefferson County, all of the law enforcement agencies and the district attorney's office, that human trafficking is an issue. So a lot of people who end up working in these massage centers that offer services beyond massages, sexual services, don't do that as a matter of choice. They tend to be immigrants who have come to this country, oftentimes for a price. They're brought to this country. Person says, "Hey, you owe us $10,000," and we've all seen stories in the Washington Post, New York Times, and 60 Minutes. And they're put into fields like cosmetology, nails, and they have to work off that trip being brought into the community. They're also put into situations that involve prostitution. And we see a lot of this, throughout the nation and in Wheat Ridge, involving massage parlors. So, or I should say massage centers that tend to advertise as Asian, and they exist in other places. So we try to address that and deal with that, but there are certain laws that we have to follow when we do that. So we can't engage in sex acts, we can't engage in entrapment kinds of things. So we have to be pretty careful about how we look at these situations, but we have been able to make some arrests. We've been able to close some of these centers down, but some of them operate again. And again, what we need are citizens who report suspicious activity that's going on there, so we can take a look. But overall, what you'll see is we average somewhere in the vicinity of 9 to 10 arrests a year. This year we've had 1 arrest to date. We work with the FBI, so you're aware, in the State Attorney General's and the District Attorney's Office on what's a program called Operation Cross Country that looks specifically at prostitution from a trafficking kind of perspective. So we're looking for runaways that are being forced into prostitution, and we're also looking, for other women and trying to arrest the individuals who are involved in organizing these syndicates. So we'll participate again this year in Jefferson County with local law enforcement to try to address that. And if there are specific questions about this, I've got some folks here that can answer questions that you might have. So one of the things, if I was a citizen sitting in your chair, I'd ask is, well, Chief, what are you doing about this? How are you trying to address this? So we're trying to do it from a couple of perspectives. We have a pretty strong and dynamic crime prevention unit. They're in the back there. We have trying to really promote Neighborhood Watch. So how many of you are involved in a Neighborhood Watch program in your neighborhoods? So what I'd really like to see is all your hands go up, right? Because Neighborhood Watch is a way that you can meet your neighbors. You can form relationships with your neighbors, and the idea is to create that relationship so when they're out of town, you're looking out for them. When you're out of town, they're looking out for you. And we've got plenty of information about that. We've got about 26, I think, current neighborhood watch programs in the city. I'd like to have 106, right? I'd like to have every neighborhood participating in that, because one of the ways that we're going to address crime in our communities is by having citizen engagement. So there's a theory about policing, and the theory, revolves around the issue of who's responsible for the safety in their community. And it's a two-pronged responsibility, right? I'm paid as a police officer to provide law enforcement services to this community. And we take that responsibility very seriously, but we're expensive. People are expensive, and so you can't afford, as citizens, to have a cop on every block, right? So what we need are law-abiding citizens who care about the quality of life in their community, the crime in their community, traffic in their community, and want to make it safer. And one of the ways of doing that is getting engaged in these crime prevention strategies and programs so you can do a better job of keeping your neighborhood safe. If I could have a group of you in every neighborhood in the community, we could have a pretty strong community, and probably a much safer community than we do today, because people are engaged and involved. And that's one way of dealing with that issue. So crime prevention's not up there, but it's one of our major efforts. We also have a program called SAFER. And SAFER stands for Statistical Analysis for Effective Response. So my staff and I meet on a monthly basis, and we look at the same kind of information that I presented to you here. And so we look at monthly charts of where crime's occurring, where we're seeing accidents, what are the dynamics that are leading to all of these issues, and we talk about strategies of, hey, how can we address this? Can we attack this from an education perspective, a prevention, a deterrence, getting information out, doing a media story. How can we make the community safer? We also have a crime-free housing and hotel and motel program. So even though we have what I would describe as lower tier hotels and motels, we do try to work with them to make sure that they meet the city's standards in regards to health and safety. So we do annual inspections of all our hotels and motels and annual inspections of our larger apartment complexes, to try to address, issues around health, crime, and safety. And so we do those on an annual basis. We also have a program that we call TLC. So some of you may live in a neighborhood that's been part of a TLC program. So TLC stands for Tender Loving Care. No, it stands for Traffic, Life Quality, and Crime. And so we've tried to identify specific neighborhoods in our community that might have a higher rate of quality of life, so nuisance code kinds of issues, traffic issues, or crime issues. And we do a targeted approach where we'll go into that neighborhood, we'll have a meeting with residents, so we will go out and we'll put an invitation on everybody's doorstep. Come to this meeting on this date. Our churches, our faith-based community has been really responsive to letting us hold meetings in their facilities. And we'll have a meeting. We'll talk about the issues we're seeing as a city and a police department. We'll have folks from Parks and Public Works, community development there. We sometimes have our elected officials there. And then we'll listen to the citizens and say, what do you see as the problems? And oftentimes what citizens will tell us is not what we've seen. It's the really basic issues of, hey, my neighbor doesn't take care of his lawn, his backyard looks like a pit, we don't know who lives there. There are people moving in and out of there all the time. So we take those kinds of things and use that data then to do an analysis of the neighborhood to see what the problems are that we identify. We advise citizens about nuisance code issues and traffic safety kinds of things, crime issues, give people the opportunity to clean their neighborhood up if that's a big issue. We have dumpster days. You might have seen those advertised where we bring in big dumpsters and we let people load those up because that's a big problem from a nuisance perspective. And then we'll go in, I call it the carrot and stick approach. We use the carrot, education, providing resources, give people an opportunity to clean up, and then we'll take enforcement action if we need to address issues. We'll also target that area from an officer and a community service officer perspective, trying to work that neighborhood a little bit more in our free time. And we'll also try to get bicycle officers in there, so we can have some interaction with the citizens. It's a lot easier to talk to somebody on a bike or on foot than it is if they're just driving a car and they drive by you, right? So those are all efforts that we're making to try to address some of these issues that we're seeing. And then we got approval from City Council last year to add 4 more officers to our sworn strength. Anybody want to hazard a guess of how long it takes to hire, select, or interview, select, and train an officer to go out and work the street? Okay, a year? Year and a half? How long? 8 months. Okay. All right. So it takes us from the day we do an advertisement to where we get somebody that can go out in a car by themselves and do their job is about 14 to 16 months. So when City Council told me last November I could hire 4 additional officers, I'm really not going to see that until, potentially the end of this year or early next year. And then the other challenge we have in that is we have people that retire and people that decide police work's not for them. So we're in this constant recruitment mode. So I'm going to put on my recruiting hat now and say, if there's anybody that is thinking about a law enforcement career, that is interested in doing that, please let one of the uniformed officers in the back know, and we'll get them out for a ride-along and talk to them about the program. To work in Wheat Ridge, you got to be 21. You've got to have 2 years of college credits, so essentially an associate's degree, and you can't have committed any felonies and certain misdemeanors. So, we're looking for people of high character and values, to work in that agency. We're pretty serious about having the right person in here. So if you know anybody from your church or your neighborhood, you know, a nephew, niece that's interested in law enforcement, let us know. So those are all efforts that we've made to try to address some of these issues. So if you were to ask me, Chief, what are the critical issues that we are just facing? Homelessness is a big issue, right? You simply have to look at the Greenbelt, some of the challenges that we in Arvada and Denver and Adams County, Jefferson County and Golden on their end have all had along the Clear Creek Greenbelt with camps that have popped up. And you certainly see it reflected in some of the major intersections with the folks that we have that are, you know, panhandling for money. So what are we trying to do to address that? We're working actively with the county and other law enforcement and human services agencies to try to come up with programs to find folks the resources. Family Tree is a big nonprofit that's involved in homelessness. There's the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative. It's a big funding group. We're working with them, working with our faith-based community, you know, throughout the county to try to find housing options for people who are homeless. We have a severe weather network that we use when the weather hits a certain temperature and we have inclement weather. If we find homeless people on the street, we can get them into some of the lower tier hotels and motels in the county, all to deal with this. But this isn't a law enforcement problem necessarily to solve. It's really a community problem. And we really need community engagement to try to deal with this. I mean, we can deal with some of the, you know, the issues that are criminal in nature, and non-criminal that revolve around homelessness. But if we're going to solve homelessness, it's really going to take, I think, a deep dive look at what are the issues here as they pertain to mental health and addiction, and how do we get people out of the criminal justice system who are homeless and get them into the programs that we need. And it's going to take people brighter than me to, you know, to solve that issue. But I want you to know that your police department and city are very engaged in trying to find some solutions to some of the challenges that we're seeing with homelessness. Mental health is a big issue. So some of you may be old enough to remember in the mid-1980s, you know, Washington, President Reagan made the decision to take homelessness out of an inpatient basis, so mental health institutions and mental hospitals, and direct money to outpatient resources, because there was concern that the in-house treatment methods were just finding ways to house people that had mental health disabilities, really didn't address sort of those problems. So they wanted to go more to a community-based model. Mental health is challenging in this community and other communities. We've gotten about 80%, I'll get to you just in a minute, Joyce. We got about 80% of our folks that work in patrol right now trained in crisis intervention training to deal with people with mental health issues. But the challenge is you know, there are not the programs and the resources to get all of them into the treatment options they need to have there. And it's a real challenge for law enforcement, because being mentally ill is not a crime, you know, but it can be a civil commitment kind of situation. Yes, Joyce?
I think you mentioned both in 2016 as well as 2017, crime is up.
Yes.
And homelessness is also up. Is there any correlation?
There's a little bit of a correlation, but it doesn't tie to the significant increase that we saw. I mean, you'll get homeless people who, you know, will go into you know, a Safeway or a King Soopers or a Walmart, you know, in a small store, and they might shoplift something that they need, but that doesn't explain the total increase in terms of crime overall. I don't think our homeless people are stealing a lot of cars. The people that they're involved in the theft of a lot of cars tend to fall into the categories of people who have drug addictions, you know, so they're stealing cars, or they're involved in gangs. Is another area where we tend to see those kinds of things, or other criminal syndicates where they're stealing cars to take them to Mexico is a location for a lot of cars. So if you drive an F-150 or 250 Ford pickup truck that was made in the 2000s, that's a pretty hot car right now to be stolen. So I watch my 2003 Ford pickup truck like a hawk, you know, because, you know, they get stolen, they're easy to steal, and they're going to Mexico. We know that. So you know, we're working, you know, with the Metro Auto Theft Task Force to try to identify those crime syndicates. And they're, you know, engaged in doing that and making lots of arrests, but, you know, it's a pretty easy truck to steal. If you drive a Honda Civic that was made in the 1990s, early 2000s, that's a pretty easy car to steal. You know, you can take a key, you can file it down, you know, into a sort of a V-shaped kind of key. You take all the edges off it, you stick it in, you jiggle it, and you can start most Hondas that way. So I mean, they're easy to steal, right? So, nice to know. So if you have one of those keys and we catch you, that's being in possession of a criminal device, and we'll arrest you. That's part of crime prevention. I'm just making you aware. And then the other issue that is of concern is we've seen a significant increase in this community in the use of heroin, and all the communities have. You know, we've seen I think the last stat I saw was our response to heroin-related calls for service has increased 4 times in the last couple of years. Pretty significant. So there is an opiate crisis. You see a lot of discussion on national news, local news about that. I know we're involved in a county-wide effort with the Department of Health and other law enforcement agencies and human services, and trying to address some of these issues. The city's engaged in that. We've got a couple council members that are engaged in a committee right now looking at ways to provide education to our school students on drugs and alcohol addictions, tobacco use, those kinds of things. But that's a pretty significant issue as well. And then I think we'll direct you on a couple of places. So people oftentimes want to know, well, where can I find statistics on crime? So we have 2 documents that are on our website. We've brought a few copies of our 2016 annual report. But if you go to our website, and here's the web address, but you can just go to the City of Wheat Ridge website, go to Government Services, go to the Police Department, and when you look at that front page of the Police Department, you're going to see my smiling mug on there, okay? But right underneath that, on the right-hand side, is a thing that's called Policies and Documents, right? And under that document section, you'll find 5 years worth of annual reports. If you want to read about the Police Department, you'll see what the issues are. And 2 years ago, we started to put together a pretty lengthy document called Performance Measures. So we've identified some key categories that we want to start measuring on an annual basis. It's about a 60-page document that analyzes a lot of different performance measurements for our organization. Crime is one of those, traffic, quality of life. But we also look at citizen complaints, we look at bias-based complaints, we look at the number of commendations we receive, the number of lawsuits that we receive, all to try to identify trends and patterns that we can use to make our organization better. So we're just about done with our 2016 performance measures report. We're keeping our crime analysts busy, but we'll have that, so we'll have the 15 and 16 documents in there. If you need some good reading material, something exciting to read, before you go to sleep at night, they're really good documents. But they're important documents because they share with you as community members what's going on in your community. And you're the folks that are going to drive council members to make the policy decisions that they need to make, and also drive us, as a police department to be better and more effective in the services that we provide.
Chief, this is also on the homepage. So
right.
If you don't want to have to click down, it's right there on the homepage, Facebook and Twitter as well tonight.
All right, thanks, sir. And so questions and answers. I'm going to direct some of my staff in the back here to help me answer some of those. So come on up. Don't be bashful, guys. I'm going to hand this mic out. So.
Could you ask our folks to repeat the question so that we can catch?
Yes, right. So, Leah.
Yeah, can you explain why sex offenses against children are a type 2 crime?
Anybody want to take that?
explain that?
So I can. I can. So the question was, why are sex offenses against children, sex assaults against children, a type 2 offense? So you remember when I told you that that was a UCR definition and category? So UCR is 70, 80 years old now. It's developed in the 30s. So it hasn't caught up to where we are. You might remember 3 or 4 years ago that there were certain sex assaults that weren't captured as sex assaults, particularly if they involved same-sex kinds of sex assaults, because that wasn't viewed as a sex assault. So those things are changing from a UCR perspective. What I've tried to do here to try to explain crime is to put it in a format that might be familiar to you, because UCR is what's reported on all the time. If you go to the CBI website, you can look at crime in Colorado and crime by community. It's all UCR based. So from my perspective as a chief, a sex assault on a child is one of the most serious offenses that can occur, right? So when I look at crime, I don't put it into type 1 or type 2. I list it from the highest priority to the lowest. And sex assaults on children is something that we look at and take very seriously. We have detectives that are dedicated to that. We have a very strong relationship with Ralston House. We do a very strong program in the county overall in terms of how we do our forensic exams, how we do our forensic interviews, and the follow-up services that are offered to children and families involved in those kinds of situations. I'd put Jefferson County law enforcement and the district attorney's office at the top of the list in terms of how we respond and act on those. So don't confuse how UCR labels those with how serious we take those, because we take them very seriously. Anybody else, Mark, did you want to comment on that at all?
No, I mean, we've identified that as a very serious issue. In fact, I'm the sergeant in charge of the Crimes Against Persons team, and my team works these cases. Out of the 5 detectives I have 2.5 working crimes against children. So I've got half of my detectives working those. So it keeps us busy. Yeah, because if they're that important, we need to dedicate that as many resources as we can to it.
Thanks,
My question is that performance measures report where you all report out the data of sort of interactions by race, like law enforcement interactions by race compared to the percent of the population. I know I've seen that on the website. Is that?
So the question was on the performance measures report, if we report out on contacts by race and age and gender. That's part of it. That's a small part of what we look at. We look at, in particular, we look at bias-based complaints. So those are complaints that, where the officer arrested me because of, bias, my race, my ethnicity, my gender, those kinds of things. We take all of those kinds of complaints, even if they're anonymous, and we investigate those to try to make a determination. We also do a lot of training, so you all know, around the whole issue of implicit bias. That's a concern, certainly a concern, by our General Assembly and our legislators. They've mandated training around that. But I want you to know that we are ahead of the curve as an agency in terms of the training that we do. We're a nationally accredited police department. We're one of 700 plus police departments in the nation that go through the process of accreditation through the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement. Biased policing complaints, and complaints in general are something that they have standards around and they look at very seriously. We just received in July our 3rd award, so we're assessed every 3 years, and we just got our 3rd award. So it's a time-consuming, difficult process. We hold ourselves to about 464 standards across all aspects of policing, from administration and budgeting and hiring and promotions to our patrol operations, investigations, vice and intelligence, or property evidence function, traffic. I could go on and on. So it's a pretty comprehensive list of standards that we try to hold ourselves accountable to. So all in an effort to provide you, effective law enforcement services.
I really just want to commend you for reporting that level of transparency on that piece, given sort of a national conversation on that. And to me, that seems like we were just really a leader in that area. In many areas. The letter you wrote to in the Wheat Ridge Gazette a while ago, where it was sort of just about your approach to community policing. I think it's just, I really appreciate that, is when you're having a national conversation and then you look locally at where we are, and it's like, that's my values are reflected here. I just really appreciate that.
Well, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks. We all appreciate
Thank
that.
you all very much.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I had a traffic question.
Sure, go ahead.
Does Wheat Ridge use the yellow flashing left turn arrow? Like you see, I've seen it in our map, where the red left turn arrow will change to yellow and flash, and it helps the traffic flow.
It's
There. Just a 26 in Wadsworth has one. That's Lakewood's. So it's not really ours, but it does work at the southbound Wadsworth. And I think you'll see more and more of that. That's kind of an engineering public works project that they work on, and I know they started some, just to see how that would work, and it's working out real well, just like you said. So we would like to see more.
44th and Kipling would be great.
Well, another issue there is some of those intersections are technically CDOT's intersections, like Wadsworth and Kipling are state highways. So, our engineers would have to work to get it approved through CDOT, and it's a little bit more of a process than like a side street that we can do ourselves.
So Mike's right. We have a lot of state highways that go through, so they don't really fall under the jurisdiction of the city. They're state run. But that we have a monthly traffic issues meeting, so I'll bring that issue up to our public works director and see if there are any more plans to install those. So, all right. So thank you for bringing that up. Yes, Mayor.
We have a limit on the amount of unrelated people who can live in a house. And I know that that's going to be very difficult to police that. But I know sometimes we get reports of that, or I have heard reports of that. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Jim can.
I know it's one of your favorites.
It is a complicated issue. It's difficult to determine how many persons are related, and there are some folks that would say that's none of the city's business or the state's business or anyone's business, and others that think that this actually causes some kinds of problems. The way we like to look at it is, what is the root cause? Why are you really calling? Is it because this bothers you? Or is it because of traffic, of parking, of noise? So let's address those issues and see if we can come to some conclusions there. Other than that, we might go and ask people, are you related? And if they tell us no, then we're pretty much done. So.
It's a difficult issue partially to address, as Jim said, because we don't have the authority to go in the house and demand documentation. They're complicated. It takes time to develop a case. We've had a couple of cases where we've had people who have cooperated, and we found out that there are too many non-related people living in that particular house, and we've been able to address that through education, sometimes enforcement. But it's not easily done. It's not simply just because a neighbor says this is what I'm seeing is not enough of a standard to meet a probable cause standard to write a citation. So they're difficult to deal with.
I get asked that.
I do too.
Yeah.
So I do too. I had another hand up, John.
I actually get about 6 of them.
We'll take them. I'll give you one, and then I'm going to let somebody else ask, and then we'll come back.
So first of all, let me go back to District 4. I've lived here for over 40 years. I'm currently in District 4, where I appreciate you touching on what I call the 3 H's, what I see as the problem out there, the hookers, heroin, and homelessness. And it's getting bad. And when I speak to the marijuana issue, I have to wonder, the 35,000 people that lived in Wheat Ridge 10 years ago, are these the people that are now on heroin and now homeless, or has that been brought in? And when I speak to marijuana, I think that we as a city, and like you said, the neighboring cities have all been kind of hit with an influx of people that came here. These aren't Wheat Ridgians or Wheat Ridgers from 20 years ago. These are people that have come here, and now they're standing on our street corners and sleeping in our cars. trucks, so on and so forth. So can you speak to that part of it that says, you know, where these people are coming from, and are they all in Wheat Ridge, metro area, and or Colorado because of legalized marijuana?
Well, you know, looking at the homelessness issue is truly complex. Like the chief covered some of that earlier. It's like trying to pin down exactly why this is occurring. I'll be honest with you, we haven't determined that yet. We haven't made a direct correlation with marijuana because homelessness is kind of increasing across the nation in several cities. So it's like, well, but this is our backyard. So, but I can tell you that statistically, I just looked at recent statistics that shows that we have the highest increase in veterans who are homeless, like 24%. Across the nation, we're the highest in the state of Colorado. Why is that? We don't know. And you know, you bring up marijuana, all I could say from at least my perspective is legalized marijuana has not been a good thing for our state. That's just my personal feeling. I'm a native, I've seen this area change, the whole metro area change along with everybody else. And, you know, the issues, you know, we're trying to wrap our mind around it. It's truly a societal issue. Like the chief said, it's more than just we can't force our way out of this situation. We're trying to address it the best we can through, you know, projects like the Crossroads project, where we're educating people. We're trying to get people off the street. We're not focusing on enforcement. We're trying to get them into the programs. There's all these programs that we have. Jefferson County is a great county. I mean, we have a lot of resources here for homeless folks, and it's just a matter of getting them into those programs and letting them know that they're available. But unfortunately, a lot of these people want to live like this. It's kind of bizarre. We're seeing it. What the term is home free or something like that. They're actually people that don't want services. They want to live on the street. They want to smoke their dope. And there's not much we can do about that because they're really not violating any laws. They're unattractive. They're soliciting on the side of the highway. We're trying to work with CDOT to, you know, post those as no trespassing zones so we can enforce them. So we're working on it, but there's no easy answers right now. So.
Well, I can appreciate that. That's the one thing that I keep hearing, you know, community engagement, get involved, get engaged. And I appreciate that fact that, you know, it's all of us together to try to make Wheat Ridge better. And I would agree 100% when you see the homeless sweep down in Denver, give it about a week and they come out here. I'm sure that if you ask them, why are you in Wheat Ridge? Why did you go to Aurora? Why didn't you go back to Denver? It's the same reason we're all in Wheat Ridge, because it's nice in Wheat Ridge.
So Adams County, Douglas County, Arapahoe County are all seeing significant increases in homeless populations there. We're, you know, talking about newer communities, you know, certainly newer as compared to, you know, Wheat Ridge, all facing the very same issue. It's not unique to our community. Arvada, you know, has a really significant issue in parts of their community, and then their Old Town area, Lakewood does, you know, in the Belmar area and along some of their green belts, John. I would tell you this. I think when you start talking about, you know, the issues you're seeing in District 4, I'd relate it to peeling an onion, right? And so the issues might look pretty simplistic, you know, homelessness, heroin, you know, prostitution. But really, when you start peeling those back, they're a lot more complicated. So some of it, I think, is around economic development. You know, how do you take these areas in the community that tend to have higher crime rates, and how do you turn those around? So if you'll remember, if you've been around Denver for 40 years, the Lodo area of Denver and the Rhino area, which is so hot right now, you wouldn't take your family down there 40 years ago. Those were areas where homeless people hung out and you know, some really bad dudes. I mean, you just wouldn't go down there, right? I used to work for a hardware company that had a warehouse down there, and they'd always send 2 of us because, you know, the types of folks that you'd run into 50 years ago. And you look at that today, you know, the economics have changed what Lodo looks like, and they've really changed what you know, the River North area or the Rhino area looks like. Those are pretty hopping areas. So some of it is, to a degree, is a law enforcement challenge and concern, but the other piece of it is how do we take these areas where we see a quality of life that we don't like, and how do we as a city, citizens and our elected officials and our departments, sort of change that dynamic. And so you all know that's part of the discussion that I'm having with the city manager, community development, and public works and parks and recreation, is how do we take some of these areas like the I-70 Kipling corridor and change that dynamic. CDOT wants to do a big project there and create more lanes and do a new bridge and exit ramps, new entrance ramps, but that could be 10 to 20 years down the road, because they don't have the money to do it right now. So how do we bridge those kinds of gaps, to be a better community? And some of these issues we can't arrest our way out of. We're going to have to find some other strategies to sort of deal with that. You'd asked a question about, sort of drugs and heroin. These are Wheat Ridge residents. I mean, there are some really good people that live in this community that have opiate addictions. They're not bad people. They have addictions. So we have to be really careful about how we, sort of label that. When you look at the people that are engaged in those behaviors, you're really talking about addiction kinds of behaviors. And a lot of these people are middle class, individuals who developed a habit that now they're hooked on, and they resort to, to crime. Now, I'm not saying all of them are Wheat Ridge residents, because a lot of them that live in these hotels and motels aren't, right? But they come from throughout the state. So, it's an issue of statewide importance as well. There are a number of committees that our legislators have put together to try to look at how do we address this and address it differently than we did maybe 40 years ago in terms of throwing everybody into jail, right? Jail is not going to solve the addiction problem, right? You got to have other programs to do it. And so I can equate it to trying to peel back an onion. It's complicated, and it'll make you cry. So, other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah,
so you mentioned a lot. I mean, first of all, thank you. This was a really high quality presentation, and it's clear you guys put a lot of work into it. So thank you. So looking at some of the key things that you're addressing around like homelessness and some of the human trafficking, as well as like some of the local neighborhood scale preventative things, who are some of your key like regional partners you're working with and local partners? Because it seems like a lot of these things you're addressing are strategic partnerships and not just contained within the police department.
Sure. So the question, if I could summarize it, is how are we working with other stakeholders to address some of the, the crime, quality of life issues and traffic issues that we're seeing. So we're working with a lot of stakeholders. For example, we've outreached to our faith-based community in Wheat Ridge on ways that we can work together to address resource issues. So all of our churches are engaged in activities, right? And so they've got their favorite things that they like to work on, but they don't always communicate well with other churches in regards to what they're doing or with city government. So we've been meeting with our churches now to say, how can we create sort of a resource list of what churches are doing things? Some churches have food banks. Some might offer shelter. Some might offer programs for specific kinds of people. So we're working with them to try to put together a resource book and agreements with about 12 of the churches to start meeting monthly to talk about issues in the community and how we can leverage what government does and what churches do to be more effective as a city. The other thing that we're doing is we have really strong relationships with other local law enforcement agencies, with the district attorney's office, human services, on working on a variety of different programs to provide resources to victims and their families. We've got a really strong relationship with our nonprofits. So Ralston House provides forensic interviews and services to victims of families and victims of child abuse and sex abuse. So really strong relationship with them in regards to that. A really strong relationship with Family Tree. Division Chief Lawrence sat on their executive committee for 8 years. Was really engaged with that particular group, and we work a lot with them around homeless issues and domestic violence and child abuse issues, and providing resources that as a city government we don't have, but they have programs that that they offer. So you're all aware, all of my commanders and division chiefs all have to participate in some sort of community group, or state group. So Jim has been involved with Family Tree. I'm engaged with Rotary. I've got a sergeant and a commander that are involved with the Optimists, the Kiwanis Club, all in an effort to try to, the Wheat Ridge Business Association, all in an effort to try to build capacity in the community in regards to what we can do as a community to be safer and a better community. So, and I could give you 100 more examples. Since I'm talking to you, Rachel, we've got a pretty strong relationship with the bicycle group in the community, both Public Works and the police department with ATAT, and working on active transportation options and bicycling and healthy communities. We're engaged in all of those different things, as you know. So, great question. Yes, ma'am.
On the same topic, sort of, I'm at Applewood shopping area a lot, and I'll see a family begging for something, and I feel so bad because I know I'm not going to do them any good if I hand them a few bucks or a granola bar or something. And I keep wondering, is there somebody I can call and say, hey, look, there's this family with some young children that are begging. Can you come and help them, or whatever? Is there anything I could do about that?
Sure. So the question, if I can summarize it, is, as a citizen, if I see, an individual who is panhandling or a family, is there somebody I can call to provide resources to? So at the Applewood Shopping Center, that's another project area that we have. So we're actually having officers that are working there extra duty, and then during their regular shifts. And so if we identify those groups of people, we're contacting them. We're trying to find out what their situation is. So we try to do an assessment of what they need, and then we provide them with a resource list of organizations that they can call or we can call for them to try to get them the resources that they need to get. I think part of the challenge that we see is there are a lot of organizations that are trying to help homeless people in Jefferson County and throughout the metro area. And what I try to encourage people to do is there's a website, there's an organization called Heading Home, Jefferson County Heading Home, that you can look at on the website, that is really trying to develop some capacity in Jefferson County in regards to how do we respond to and effectively deal with and handle this growing homeless population that we see. So some of it's around housing, some of it's around employment, some of it may be around mental health or addiction issues, but how can we direct them to the resources that they need? So you can go to that website and find out everything that we're trying to do in Jefferson County. So again, it's a partnership with a lot of different entities to try to address this problem. There's some elected officials in here that are involved in that, as well as police departments and others, and look at that. If you want to give money to help the homeless, my best advice is you got to do what your heart tells you to do. But if I was to give money to, and I do give money to homeless related issues, I'd give it to an organization. A local organization. Mean Street Ministries is a ministry out of a church at 13th and Brentwood. They actually provide housing and housing options for families who are homeless, and they house people there in the church in the gymnasium, every night. And they do a lot of really good work. They do a lot of outreach to homeless populations in Jefferson County. There's, Family Tree has a homeless section to it, and they're actually the ones that are coordinating the Heading Home effort, another great organization to get engaged in. There's a list of organizations, that I contribute money to try to help the homeless, because it's a better use of my dollar. I know it's going to help somebody and maybe not necessarily buy them,
But is there a number I can call and say, hey, look, there is this family that is at Applewood right now, and they look like they're...
I mean, you can call the police department or non-emergency number if you have a concern around a homeless person. We get those calls all of the time, in regards to that, and we'll respond out. It's a priority-based kind of response, and we'll do an assessment of who they are. But we can't, some people want us to respond to sort of kick them out, move them along, and we can't really do that unless there's a violation of the law or they're aggressively panhandling. So our point is to contact them, find out what their issue is, try to provide them some resources, and and go from there. It's a more complicated issue than calling somebody, right? But that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for doing this tonight, and I think I'm kind of piggybacking on to this comment here, but my neighbors, keep saying, we back up to Anderson Park, and we call the police a lot because of the homeless issues, and my neighbors are really, they're in a kind of bind because they don't necessarily, they think when they're calling the police that the people that they're calling on are going to be arrested and taken away, and that might not be what they want to have happen to them. And so I think this type of forum, this is the right conversation to be having, but I think that there needs to be, and maybe it's us who are in the room, some more outreach, that when you call the police, those are the resources that are being offered. I think that there's a disconnect there. And so I just thank you so much for doing this tonight, but I think there's also an opportunity for us to engage with our community and start to share that a little bit more, and offer our help to get that message out there, because I don't think people realize that you are offering resources to people instead of hauling them away. That's what my neighbors.
All of our officers are carrying a little resource guide, and it has several numbers and several options for what we say is people experiencing homelessness, because we're not identifying people as you are homeless and that's a label kind of thing. One of the things we say is that if you have met one person that is homeless, you've met one person that's homeless. There's a bunch of stories for every single person, and we need to look at them as people. When we get the call of somebody, let's say the family at 32nd and Youngfield that are out there, we get those calls and we're going to check their welfare. We're going to make sure that the kids are healthy and safe. If they're not, we need to look at options to address that. If they are, if they're fine, we're going to leave them alone. We don't arrest people if we don't have crimes. If we do have crimes, we are going to arrest them, because that's one of the things we do as a police department. If they have warrants, if they're wanted for certain crimes, or if they've committed a crime, we'll deal with that. But for the most part, that's not the kind of activity that's going on. And I think that's what people want to know is, what are we doing first? Number one, first we're finding out, are you okay? And number two, can we help? And that's what we're interested in doing.
Thanks.
Other questions at all?
We got 5.
John, you got 5 left, or?
I guess my next big hot topic would be if you could speak to what happened last month when basically the city got shut down and it took 6 other law enforcement agencies to come in and open it back up. And more importantly, can you speak to what was going on in other parts of the city that when we were on the phone with dispatchers, we were told that there was a huge influx of 911 calls. Is this something that's being set up and a distraction? And even more importantly than that, can you speak to the 4 burglaries that happened 2 or 3 weeks prior that seemed like a setup to a point where we're testing the police response time and so on and so forth?
Well, so you've asked a couple questions there, so let me try to peel those one at a time and then speak again. So the one incident you're talking about is the car rally that occurred, on 44th between Ward and Kipling. I think it was 3 weeks ago now. Yeah, it went east to Kipling, but the primary area where we had a lot of folks in was that Ward to Kipling area, right? So That event that occurred was a car group that exists in the metro area. I think they're called 1320, if I'm remembering the terminology right on that. So that was set up by the owner of a business as at least as reported to us, as just a small gathering of 30 to 40, cars. And what we ended up having have happen, John, was there were about 500 cars, about 1,200 people that inundated that 44th Avenue corridor, right? And well, there's a lot of people that were impacted by that. So that occurred on a very busy night. The supervisor tried to get an assessment of what was going on. We initially asked CSP to respond in and help us with an assessment because we had other calls for service. So when you get an event like that occurs that's not planned, there are a set number of resources to handle calls for service. They're based on statistical information, from a 5-year period of time. How many cops do we need on this Saturday night between these time frames, right? And so we've got a pretty good number there for a normal night in Wheat Ridge. That wasn't a normal night in Wheat Ridge, right? So we did what we do for other communities. We called for mutual aid. So Arvada and Lakewood, Colorado State Patrol, all responded in to assist us with that issue because we didn't have the resources. I will never have the resources in this police department to respond to an event involving 500 cars, 1,200 people that's never been planned for. Just isn't going to happen. So this group has a history of showing up and doing these kinds of events throughout the Front Range. And they have a very sophisticated way of advising people of where these rallies are going to be and what they're going to do. And really, if you watch the Fast and Furious, if you've watched any of those TV movies, that's what they're out to do. They're out to have fun and show off their cars and race around, and some of them are out to create mayhem, and that's what they did. So we called in other resources. We do that sometimes. We help Arvada, we help Golden, we help Jefferson County, we help Lakewood, Edgewater, Mountain View. When your call load gets to the point that you don't have the resources to handle it, you call in, the posse, and that's what we did, and we were able to, to get that shut down and cleaned out. We've looked at criminal charges. We did have one case that involved a dual hit and run that we were able to arrest an offender on and charge, but we weren't able to address some of the other noise issues and tie those directly to a specific person that we could cite. We didn't have any reported assaults that occurred on that. A lot of it was neighborhood concerns around the noise and traffic congestion and the feelings of safety and stuff. So that was the event, and that's how we dealt with it.
But more importantly, I think, can you speak to the fact that this 1320 group had shut that down? And I understand that you can't have enough officers on the street, and you can't prepare for that because apparently this group is pretty well organized and they're pretty sophisticated when it comes to contacting 1,200 different people in a moment's notice. I mean, maybe we should be hiring them to plan our events in the city of Wheat Ridge, but I mean, if they're that quick and they're that good, nobody expects any police department to handle it. I appreciate CSP, Jefferson County, Denver, everybody that came. What makes me nervous is that the people in that area, emergency responders could have not got in if somebody's child was choking or if somebody had an emergency had to get out, fire rescue had to come in. But I guess my theory is, and my thoughts are they that sophisticated that they have this system in place that they are distracting law enforcement, and more importantly, the 4 break-ins, the 4 burglaries that happened, it was either 2 or 3 weeks earlier, that was a distraction almost. It almost felt like a distraction. 2 of those businesses being 2 blocks away from that event. Now here 2 weeks later, are we being distracted, and was that part, was it a big, okay, I'm looking at my helicopters, I know.
Well, I was going to ask, because that's where I thought we were going.
Right. That is where I go.
So here is their technology. It's called social media. Same technology the city uses, it's same technology that individuals use, right? So this is a group that's been identified by law enforcement. We're trying to gather intel on them, trying to work with you know, the organize. But there's not a firm connection to it. It's you know, in terms of well, who's the organizer of this, who's leading these kinds of things. It's a car club. They just like to have car rallies, and they like to gather, and they like to mimic, you know, the stuff that they see in movie theaters. I don't think anything was planned intentionally to overwhelm law enforcement, you know, or to take advantage of Little Wheat Ridge, because Denver's had this issue, Aurora's had it, other communities throughout the Front Range have had it. So I mean, they pop in and they pop out. It's the same with the motorcycle group that'll take over I-25. And they'll shut down a highway and a freeway. They're operating on the fringe of the laws. Sometimes they're violating laws. They're really difficult to get a handle on, because you know they're not a group that's operating in one community. They're people from throughout a broad area. So we've been working with CSP. We've been working with Denver. They're all trying to gather information on these groups and a better way of notifying agencies if we get information that they're going to operate in this manner in a particular jurisdiction, not unlike you know the organized crime groups and some of the other crime groups that operate in the community. We're always trying to gather intelligence on these kinds of things. I don't think it has a correlation to the burglaries. I'd have to know specifically which 4 burglaries you're talking about. We have about 30 a month. You know, on average in the community, but I'm not aware of any coordinated effort to make us busy so a crime could occur in a different area. That does happen. We've seen stories nationally. Certainly, I've got no information. I don't know if Mike or Tracy or Mo, if you've got any information on.
I think he's probably talking about the smash and grabs along 44th there.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Those burglaries may be connected, but they're not connected to the car show.
Yeah.
The burglaries may be connected to each other, but they're not connected to the car show.
Well, so the conspiracy theory was those 4 burglaries that happened at the exact same time with the exact same mask, the exact same cars, and everything else, being a test of police response time to either that area or the 44th and Wadsworth area. That's my conspiracy.
We have smash and grab burglaries that are occurring throughout the metro area. That MO is not unusual. We've seen it with gun stores. We've seen it with pawn shops. Seen it with vape shops. You know, it tends to be a group of offenders. Some of them gang affiliated, generally young, who pick locations throughout the metro area, and they'll commit. We've had some situations where we've had a half a dozen smash and grabs along 38th or Wadsworth in different areas. That is an MO that's being used right now. It's not designed to pull resources away from a particular area. This is people that are committing crimes. So we've certainly in Wheat Ridge seen a number of those with gun stores and pawn shops, as has Littleton and Jefferson County and Lakewood and Aurora and Denver and Thornton and everybody else. So it's more of an MO right now, John, than it is, you know, by a group of organized individuals than it is an effort to, you know, to draw police resources away. So does that help?
Yeah, I'll accept that, I guess. And I still, when you have a conspiracy theorist mind, you start to try to link everything.
I mean, crime happens, right? And so right. So if you look at that diagram that I showed up there, you know, they're looking for a specific product. So gun store burglars are looking for guns. So what do gun owners do at night when they close up? They leave their guns in a case. So we've sent a couple of letters out to gun owners in Wheat Ridge. Don't leave your guns in a glass case. You know, you might put up ballards to sort of barricade your store, and you might have chain link or some other device to sort of protect your store. But these guys are stealing cars, and they're driving through that stuff, and they got another car right behind it. So if you started putting your guns in a safe, it would reduce the number of burglars. What do gun store owners tell us? Well, that's a lot of work, Chief. You know, and then we nick the gun up, and we got to sell it for a discount. I said, well, is that a better option than having your guns stolen? You know, so I mean, there's some prevention things here that we're trying to do with some of these folks. But if you leave valuable objects in an easily accessible place, it gets to that sort of offender victim location kind of analogy. And I look at it from the perspective of what can the store owner do to harden their target, their location, and reduce the opportunity to be a victim of crime. Because if we can reduce that opportunity to be a victim of crime, these people are going to go somewhere else. They're not going to come to Wheat Ridge to commit crime because we're a crime prevention kind of community, right? We're not going to allow that. So, but if there is a conspiracy out there, we'll find it eventually. So, okay, that's right, and you'll let us know. I know you will, right? Any other questions from community?
Chief, over the last number of years, your organization has worked with other allied Lakewood Police Department, Arvada, and Golden to share resources. I think maybe your communication system and evidence gathering, or where you house your evidence. Has that been a successful program or a series of programs, and are there more opportunities for efficiencies amongst the department?
Right. So the question from Bud is, what has the police department done to seek out opportunities to share resources amongst law enforcement agencies? So Jefferson County is really a unique county from a law enforcement perspective, in the fact that we've looked for lots of opportunities to reduce taxpayer expenses, to provide certain kinds of services. So years ago, about 12 years ago, we had a crime lab that we had 2 detectives working in our organization, and we didn't need a crime lab all the time, but we needed it sometimes when we had certain major events that went on. But it didn't justify having 2 detectives working in there full time when we needed people to investigate crime. So we developed an IGA with the city of Lakewood to provide us with forensic crime lab services. So we had a homicide shortly after I came here that took 2 weeks to process the crime scene. With our relationship with Lakewood, we can get the most serious crime scene done in about 2 to 3 days. So a much faster turnaround. We had good people doing it, but we just had 2. Lakewood's got 12. So it just from a cost efficiency perspective made sense to enter into that relationship. That's since developed into a forensic crime lab that now operates at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Facility, where all our DNA evidence, firearms evidence, all our forensic evidence that needs to be processed now, we send it there instead of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. We get much quicker turnaround. We're able to process a lot of our property crime stuff where CBI is so inundated they can't do it. So a real leverage of dollars to produce a better product. We're looking at regionalizing all our 911 centers and our fire department centers. So essentially 8 entities that all have dispatch centers in the county. So when a citizen calls on a 911 call, it goes to one center, and it goes from that center call taker right to a dispatcher for that agency. Right now on some 911 calls, we have to send it to the fire department to have them dispatch it. We lose a call. Having one center will really, we think, improve efficiencies. And then all of our centers right now are buying their own equipment, right? So we buy equipment for our center, Arvada does for them, Lakewood does, Golden does, West Metro Fire, so on. And we all have backup centers. Now we can have all of that equipment in one center, so technically less equipment because we're in one center and we only need one backup center. We don't need 16 backup centers because we have 8 locations doing this. So we think that that's going to be a real bang for the buck. We think when this center opens up in 2018, the overall reduction in dollars being spent on a comm center for us will be about a 20% reduction initially. The 9/11 Authority Board, you all pay a fee to the 9/11 Authority Board for all your phone lines and mobile phones. A lot of that money, which traditionally wasn't used to pay for dispatchers and call takers, they've made a commitment to us that they'll help fund some of the salaries and the benefits for these people. So it ends up really being an improvement in service delivery, and we think it'll lower cost overall. So that's another example. Records management system. We all have a records management system. For Wheat Ridge, it would cost us about $1 to $1.5 million to get a new records management system for the police department. We were due to get one. Our current system is about 17 years old. 5 of the agencies in Jefferson County got together. We purchased a top-tier system. It cost us about $350,000 to buy into the system because we leveraged, every jurisdiction, to buy one product that we could use regionally. And that'll kick off next year as well. So we're looking for opportunities to, to regionalize and to do things better, but we still want to keep our own identity, still want to be the Wheat Ridge Police Department, still want to provide services to our community, but also leverage, efficiencies and effectiveness. So, other questions? Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I have some questions about gangs. You had mentioned that they commit a lot of crimes here. Are they Wheat Ridge residents? Do we have Wheat Ridge gangs?
So the question is do we have Wheat Ridge gangs? So we have gang members that live in Wheat Ridge. Gangs are not as territorial as they used to be, although, their names are. So you may see, a West Side Bloods, for instance, or North Side Mafia. So they might come from a specific neighborhood, but they commit crimes throughout the metro area because, again, they're looking for a particular kind of victim, a specific location, right, to commit their crimes. So do we have gang-related crimes in Wheat Ridge? Yeah, sometimes, but it's not like it was in the 90s and early 2000s. But gangs do exist in all of our communities. Other questions at all? John, you're 2, you got 3?
I'm number 3.
That's what I thought.
I'll take up that is, who is the most predominant gang in Wheat Ridge, would you say? Would that be the 211, would be more than anybody else?
We have certainly had more interaction with the 211 crew than we have with other gangs. And 211 crew, for everybody's information, is a prison gang network, so they've been associated with some of the burglaries and auto thefts that we've had in the community. That's a group that I'm well aware of. There have been some contacts with other ones as well.
Okay, that's probably more predominant.
Yeah, unless somebody's got updated information on that. Mo?
Yeah, we deal with 211 quite a bit. They've actually calmed down in this area a little bit, but 211s and West Side Bloods are the two that we run into most often. But we get passing through various other games.
Okay, that was actually just a follow-up question, but my actual number 3 question is, can you talk briefly, and I know that's hard for you, you speak very well.
You're not the only one that says that. I talk to most of them.
And sometimes we can appreciate that you're actually getting all the information out there. But briefly to the SROs, how are we doing? Where's our school sitting? We still have the same number in our schools. We're not sharing, we're not deleting.
Tracy.
The same number of SROs, you mean?
Yes.
We do have the same number, yeah. We've got 2 SROs in the primary education.
As much as I know Jefferson County schools would like to shut down every school we could and save our SROs, we could put them somewhere else. I'm hoping that doesn't happen anytime real soon. So the plan is to still have as many SROs. Is there going to be an increase or decrease? I mean, can you speak to where we're at and where we're going?
Well, we had hoped to get a 3rd one. The budget wouldn't support it, so we may revisit that at another time. But right now, we're going to stick with the 2 we've got. We have one primarily in the high school and one that bounces back and forth mostly between 5-8, or it's not 5-8, or Stevenson and the Everett.
And Sandusky Academy. So, your issue is we've always had 2 SROs. We did for about a 3-4 year period of time have 3. That's because we got a grant to fund that position. So what I have to look at as the chief is how best to utilize the resources that we have. And there's not although there's some justification to have a 3rd SRO, I need patrol officers and detectives as well. I need administrative support staff. So we're waiting to gather more information. There was a concern for a while that Sandusky would really increase our call for service load because it's a unique kind of school situation. We certainly have calls for service there. We're trying to gauge whether or not that would justify having a 3rd SRO. And I'm not afraid to ask the city manager and council for those positions, but I do need to justify it.
Well, can I just commend the 2 that you have? I mean, I know both, and I think they're doing a great job.
I hear that all the time, so I appreciate it. So we were supposed to go to 7:30. It's almost 8 o'clock, but what a great group. I really appreciate it. You know, if somebody has a really urgent question they'd like to ask, my staff and I will hang around and for a little bit. We do have a crime prevention booth over there, community services over here. There's some swag. You can't go to one of our events without getting something for coming. So thanks. Yeah, get a dog leash. But thanks for coming, and please ask questions if you have them afterwards. Thanks, you very much.
Thanks, Chief.
You bet.